Welcome to The Red-Haired Archaeologist. I am your host, author, and sunscreen advocate, Amanda Hope Haley. Thank you for spending some time with me, studying artifacts our first-century Near Eastern ancestors left behind, and considering if those items just might change how we read or read into Scripture. During Season 2 of this podcast, I have largely focused on New Testament sites. And that's largely because Season 1 of the podcast was about Old Testament sites. But today I'm going to be cheating just a little bit with my own self-imposed rule. We're going to be talking about a city called Hebron. And if you've never heard it pronounced that way before, you are not alone. For my entire life, anytime I have seen Hebron in the Bible, I've pronounced it Hebron. And so today, if I mess up and get on a tear talking about Hebron, forgive me. For 38 years, I mispronounced it. And it's really hard to correct those kind of things in your mind when you've done something for most of your life. The city's actually pronounced Hebron. And the reason I feel like I'm cheating is it has a whole lot of importance in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. It was so important, one particular site there, that Herod the Great in the 1st century BCE went and he built a synagogue there. So that's where I'm cheating. Technically, the synagogue falls into the timeline of the New Testament period. It certainly would have been there in the 1st century CE, but actually the city of Hebron and the location that this synagogue honors is not ever mentioned in the New Testament. I'm cheating that just a little bit, but Hebron was such a transformative part of my trip to Israel. It is a place that the majority of tours of international people, they don't get to go there. And in fact, the city itself is governed in such a way that even Israelis can't go into the Palestinian parts and Palestinians can't go into the Israeli parts of the city. And so I want to explore all of the great history that is there, the archaeology, and then also talk about the city as it stands today. Hebron is an important city for all three religions that claim some sort of heritage to Abraham: Jews, Christians, and Muslims. For that reason, it is surprising that not a whole lot of archaeology has been done in the city. It probably hasn't occurred because of the political situation there, but the first real archaeological work began around 2014. That's when teams got in and went to the area called Tel Hebron, which would be the highest point of the city. It's where the ancient ruins of the city would be. And a lot of work still needs to be done there. But what has come out is they have found that during the Bronze Age, which is maybe the time period of the judges in your Bible, there's evidence that it was a well-fortified city. If you take a look in my book, it's in black and white. There's a picture that I included of a Middle Bronze Age wall that has been uncovered. And what was really cool about that to me is that you're literally just walking along the street in modern Hebron and you look down and, oh, wow, there's just this middle-aged bronze wall that has been uncovered and is running underneath the street and the sidewalk where you're walking. The ancient and the modern, like so many places in Israel, they really overlap with each other. So that's there from the Middle Bronze Age. And they find similar defenses from the Iron Age, which would have been the time when David was there, according to the Bible, bringing all of the different tribes of Israel together under one nation. That's what archaeology has told us so far. And so to learn more, what I would like to do is just really quickly go through what the Bible actually says about Hebron. And I thought that we would start with Numbers. In Numbers, the Israelites have been following Moses. They've been wandering the desert for 40 years. Right at the end of that time period, Moses says to a group of men, hey, this is the land that God has promised to us. And so we need to go out there. I'm going to send a group of spies to find out what's going on in Canaan. Take a look at these cities, see how well fortified they are, and basically just bring this information back to us so that we can plan for the future. And so in Numbers 13:22, that is what happens. He sends the men out, and two of the men who go in this, one is named Joshua and one is named Caleb. With the exception of those men, everyone who goes out, they look at the Canaanite cities in their region and they see that they are impressive, that there's a lot of agriculture. The food that is being grown is very large. The cities are very well fortified. And it's even implied that some of the people who live there are of giant physical stature. The majority of the group comes back to Moses and they say, nope, we can't do this. We don't have the power. Whereas this guy named Caleb comes back and he says, they're well fortified. This is God's promised land. Let's give it a shot. So that's the first time you hear about Hebron. It is one of the cities that these men went and scouted out. The name Hebron pops up again in Joshua. And in Joshua 10, it is described the king of Hebron, who had been in alliance with some other kings in the area. He is killed. Those other kings are killed. The cities are taken. And once all of Canaan has been conquered, then all the tribes of Israel draw lots, and each tribe is given a portion of the land that has been conquered. The area where Hebron is becomes part of the tribe of Judah's allotment. Then in Joshua 14, Caleb is given Hebron as his city as a reward for bringing the truth about the Canaanite region and its beauty back to Moses. Then we don't hear anything else about it in the book of Joshua. In Judges, there's one verse where it comes out. It's in Judges 16:3. The judge Samson had been down in Gaza City, and he sneaks out of Gaza City one night about midnight, and for no explained reason, he picks up the city gates of Gaza. Gaza would have been Philistine, and carries them all the way to Hebron and just puts the city gates in Hebron. Aside from the two cities not being very close to one another, there's also elevation change between Gaza and Hebron. In fact, Hebron is the tallest biblical city or in the Bible. It is the highest elevation. It sits about 3,000 feet above sea level. And Samson would have had to work very hard. And of course, the Bible tells us he was an incredibly strong man. Remember that in the ancient world, and I mean, really even today, the elevation of cities is often a factor when cities are built, because the taller a city is compared to the area surrounding it, the more easily defensible it is. I think that is probably one of the reasons that in the book of 2 Samuel, we see David going to Hebron and declaring that his first capital. So in 2 Samuel 2, David goes up to Hebron. The tribe of Judah, just the tribe of Judah at that point, anoints him as their king. This is after Saul has died, but Saul has some sons, and what ensues is a struggle for political power over the next 7 years. So David is running his campaign to become king of all Israel and to unite all of the tribes from this home in Hebron. Finally, in 2 Samuel 5, after he's fought multiple battles, he is anointed as the head of all of Israel's tribes. And then at that point, he moves his capital to Jerusalem, which of course comes to be known as the city of David. It is the more famous capital. But for 7.5 years, he was at Hebron. That's probably the second most famous thing that Hebron is known for. 10 chapters later, in 2 Samuel 15, David's own son, Absalom, if you're familiar with the story, he basically mounts a coup against his father and attempts to take the throne. He basically follows in his dad's footsteps, and he goes down to Hebron and gets himself anointed king there. Of course, ultimately, he does not end up taking the throne from King David, but he recognized the importance of this city to the monarchy of Israel. In 586 BCE, as was the case with so many of the cities around Jerusalem, Hebron was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And archaeologically, there is some evidence of this that they have found in the areas of the Iron Age city. A generation or so after Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the area, Nehemiah describes the Jews being allowed to come back and actually settle in Hebron and begin their lives again there. From that point forward, there is consistent history of the Jews just being there. Archaeologically, a lot more has been turned up, pun intended, now that I realize I said it. There's been a lot of stuff that's been turned up from the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE period. There's evidence of a thriving Jewish community there. There are lots of homes. There's a city center. There were ritual baths that have been discovered, indicating that the people who lived in Hebron at that time were religiously observant Jews. Maybe they weren't overly influenced by the Roman occupation in the area. There are industrial buildings, evidence of winemaking and grain milling and all those sorts of activities you would expect in a city center in Israel at the time. Hebron hung on to its position longer even than Jerusalem. It didn't get taken down until 132 CE. If you remember, the Romans took out Jerusalem in 70. So it wasn't until 132, really a generation later, that Hebron ended up being destroyed. A little bit of time passed, and once again, though, it would be inhabited by later groups. The Byzantines came in. Later, the Crusaders identified a site right on the top of Tel Hebron that they said was the location of Jesse and Ruth's burial. They built some structures up there, both for defensible purposes, but also to honor that burial. And then eventually the Ottomans came in and there was war. They took over everything. And at that point, Tel Hebron, the very top part of the city, ceased to be occupied. When you go up there and you visit now, there's basically just this volunteer olive grove that has taken over. It's actually really lovely, tall grasses, tons of olive trees. And just sprinkled in among them are the ancient ruins from the Iron Age city and other structures that had been built up there and now have been abandoned for many hundreds of years. So I have spent the last 10 minutes telling you what little has been discovered archaeologically and lining up what has been found with what we have in the Old Testament, with the stories that are in the Old Testament. In a way, I've buried the lead because the main reason that pilgrims go to Hebron is to visit something called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. The structure that you see there today was begun by Herod the Great in the 1st century BCE, and it honors the burial place of Abraham and his family. Abraham is, of course, the patriarch who Jews, Christians, and Muslims all hold in common. And in Genesis 13, we get the story of Abram. His name has not yet been changed to Abram, moving his family to Hebron near a place called the Oaks of Mamre. This is where the Bible tells us that God made his covenant with Abraham, promising him countless children and giving his family ownership of all of the land that Abraham could see. This is also where Hagar had Ishmael and where God changed Abram's name to Abraham. You will notice that this is not where Isaac was born. He was actually born in Beersheba, but at some point the family returned to Hebron because in Genesis 23 we learn that Sarah died there. That is what prompts Abraham to make his first legal purchase of land in the area. He buys a place called the Cave of Machpelah, and he purchases it from one of his Hittite neighbors. Even though God had promised this land will be yours, this is the first time that there is some acknowledgement from people outside of that relationship between Abraham and God that actually Abraham has ownership of something in the area. This is sort of God and Abraham putting their stake in the ground and claiming this location for the first time. Sarah ends up being buried in this cave. And then Genesis tells us that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are also buried there, and as are the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. Then, according to Jewish tradition, Adam and Eve are also located there. This is, of course, practically impossible to prove. No one has actually been down into the caves since 1981, but even if they did, even if we went down there, I'm not sure that DNA testing or anything like that would really be helpful in identifying the bones that are down there. But that is the tradition, and that is why the Tomb of the Patriarchs was built, and that is why it was so important to Herod the Great to honor this particular place. The structure that you see there today isn't just what Herod the Great started. This building has a 2,000-year long history of redevelopment, of redesign, of add-ons, of punching holes into walls, and everything that you can do. Every kind of remodeling you can think of seems to have happened along the way. What was started by Herod the Great were basically just the system of walls that went around it. They were 12 meters high and about 2 meters thick. And they were just built to protect the Cave of Machpelah and to be a synagogue, to be a pilgrimage point for Jews to be able to come to the area. Jews, and then very quickly thereafter, Christians as well. What he built there, the way the walls and everything were structured, mimicked the design that he used for the temple complex that surrounded the temple in Jerusalem. And we're going to talk more about that in 2 weeks. The last episode of season 2 is going to be all about the work that Herod did on the temple. And sneak preview, the Wailing Wall. I think a lot of people think that the Wailing Wall is actually a wall of the temple, or maybe even a wall of Solomon's temple, which was, of course, destroyed in 586. But what is there is actually a wall that Herod built that was part of the temple complex that broadened and made that entire area around the temple much, much larger. But what is there at the Tomb of the Patriarchs? The very bottom, the foundation of the building that is there today. I mean, you can go up to it, you can touch it as you enter the building, but those stones look like the stones that were used on the temple complex. And they are really the next best thing that we have to being able to see the temple and what it looked like 2,000 years ago, to actually witness that today. Then starting with the Byzantine Empire, which, remember, the Byzantines were Christians. Once they came in and started making their changes, then it is just a laundry list of different groups coming in and changing the building. The Byzantines came in and they basically just built onto Herod's walls. They turned what was a synagogue into a church. And then in the 7th century, the Arabs came in and they converted that church into a mosque. And then the Crusaders came in and they took it back from them and tinkered things around, made it back into a church. And then Saladin came in 1188. He won it. He converted it into a mosque, and he actually added 4 minarets. 2 of them are still there today. That he's the one who really changed the look of the place, so that from the outside, it was pretty obvious that this was a mosque and not a church and not a synagogue. On the inside, he did a ton of renovation as well. The most noticeable thing that was done after Saladin was the creation of these large rectangular structures that are called cenotaphs. And there's 7 in there. Each one is meant to represent a tomb of either a matriarch or a patriarch. You walk in and you see just these huge structures. And one is there for Abraham, one is there for Sarah, one is for Isaac, one for Rebecca, one for Jacob, and one for Leah. That's what we expect. The Bible says there's the 6 people buried in the cave of Machpelah. There is nothing for Adam and Eve. I don't believe the Muslims hold the tradition that they are down there too. But they did add a 7th. And there's debate about what this 7th cenotaph actually represents. So in the Muslim tradition, they believe that Joseph is also in the cave, that his bones were moved into the cave of Machpelah. And so they built a cenotaph for him. But Jewish Midrash claims that Esau, of course, the story of Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau, Esau sells his birthright. And so the story goes that Esau, when he sold his birthright, he also essentially sold his death right and lost family privileges to be buried in the cave. Well, an argument ensued between him and one of Joseph's grandsons. And during the struggle, Joseph's grandson decapitated him, and his head rolled into the lap of the dead Isaac, and that his head remains there today. And so, according to the Jewish tradition, that 7th cenotaph represents Esau's head. As I said, no one's been in the cave since 1981, and I don't know of any stories or corroborating evidence. Who's to say? Who's to say if Joseph or Esau's head are down there? We just don't know. That's one of those kind of funny things, and that this is a place where 2 religious traditions are existing in the same place with 2 very different stories. While those stories may coexist, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, like so much of the region, isn't exactly known for coexistence of religions in one place. And in fact, between 1267 and 1967, the Jews were not allowed to enter the mosque at all. So in 1967, Israel wages the 6-Day War. And at that point, Hebron, which was controlled by the Arabs, they surrendered to Israel, and the Jews came in and they built themselves a small synagogue under the mosque. And so at that time, from 1967 on until 1994, both religions were allowed to worship there in the same place. But something devastating happened in 1994. On February 25th, an American Israeli doctor entered the mosque during Ramadan. It was Ramadan for the Muslims. It was also Purim for the Jews that day. And he went inside and opened fire, killing 29 and wounding 125 Palestinian Muslims who were worshiping there at the time. The people who survived turned around and beat him to death. And once this leaked out into the community, the Jews and the Palestinians in the area attacked each other, and the Israeli government came in. They shut down the building. They shut down the entire city for a solid week. They were under a 24-hour curfew for about 7 days. When everything was allowed to reopen, Israel had tinkered with things quite a bit, and they basically split the building down the middle. This one building now is a mosque on the east side and a synagogue on the west side. If you are in one, you cannot get into the other side by simply going through the building, at least not on a regular day. Each religion is allowed access to the entire building on their 10 holiest days of the year. And if at any point the days overlap, as sadly they did on February 25th, 1994, then each side is given 12 hours of access to the entire building for their religious ceremonies. This dividing line is sad and ironic at the same time because this line splits the building in half, but it also splits the patriarchs in half. And so what you have is on the Muslim side, the Muslims get Isaac and Rebekah. In the Jewish synagogue, the Jews get Jacob and Leah. But then Abraham and Sarah, their cenotaphs are more toward the center of the building, and their cenotaphs are basically split in half. So their bodies aren't there. As I explained, the cenotaphs are just representative of the bones that are down in the cave below the building. But the optics of it are that Abraham and Sarah literally got split down the middle. One religion has their head, one religion has their feet. And that's sadly a perfect view of what is continuing to go on in the city of Hebron right now. This back and forth of religious rule and occupation in Israel is a story I feel like I've told multiple times on this podcast. And of course, for all of us who watch the news, it's something that sadly we are used to hearing. And so I think on first glance, it isn't surprising that the Israeli government's solution to the events of February 25th, 1994, were to split the building in half, were to basically partition the tomb of the patriarchs. And it isn't surprising that something we see happening in the nation as a whole, that actually is surprising for the city of Hebron. Because Hebron and also its Arabic equivalent means something like friend or beloved friend. Hebron is essentially the Philadelphia of Israel. Philadelphia, of course, means city of brotherly love. That's basically what Hebron means as well. The Jews and the Muslims, until 1929, had a long history of living in harmony with one another. There are memories and there is legal evidence of where Jews and Muslims lived. They were next-door neighbors with each other. They jointly owned businesses. Everyone there lived life together, and they considered themselves Hebronites first. Everyone living there was used to their lives being dominated by whichever ruling power was there at the time, be it the Muslims or the Christians or the Romans, going all the way back that far. Everyone was equally lifted up or oppressed under the government who was in charge at the time. Their religious considerations came second, but that changed in 1929. So in 1929, World War I has been fought, and after World War I, the Western powers came in and divided up what had been the Ottoman Empire and gives different Western powers control of different regions. And so where Hebron is, or basically Israel, is under something called the British Mandate. The British government is basically running things, but they have appointed cultural leaders. And in Jerusalem, there is a position called the Grand Mufti, and that person is who led Muslim spiritual life. On August 23rd, the Grand Mufti, during his daily speech to his listeners, told his people that the Jews were, at that moment, trying to take over Al-Aqsa Mosque. That is the mosque that is on top of the Temple Mount. That is where the Dome of the Rock is, that area. So this is one of the most sacred spaces for the Muslim religion. And he announced that the Jews were trying to take it over and that they were being aided by the British. So the Muslims were obviously very concerned and their emotions were inflamed. And some of the men literally ran to Jerusalem to keep this from happening. When the British saw basically an angry mob coming toward them, they did what you would expect, and they tried to push them back. When that happened, this really only validated for the Muslims what they had been told by the Grand Mufti, that the British were colluding with the Jews to take back the Western Wall, even though that wasn't actually what was happening. Anyway, when that happened, when they were turned away from Jerusalem, 700 men went down to Hebron chanting, "Kill the Jews." And for 2 days, they went door to door, looting and raping and decapitating the Jews there. 67 were killed, and all but about 10 of them were then placed in a mass grave and they were burned. So not only were these people killed, but their bodies were desecrated. And this was symbolically a really wicked thing to do to the Jewish community. Well, when that was going on, because remember, Hebron is your city of brotherly love. When that was going on, 20 Muslim families actually protected their neighbors. There are stories that are well known and that have come out of leaders of households going to the front door and telling the raiders, "No, you can't come in. These people are my brothers. You're going to have to kill me in order to get to my Jewish neighbors, my friends, the people I consider family who are here in my home." And so many Jews were actually protected by their Muslim neighbors during this terrible event. Sadly, as conflicts sped up after this, that feeling of brotherly love just disintegrated. There isn't that kind of relationship between the Muslims and the Jews in the city of Hebron anymore. This event is something that a lot of scholars point to as year zero in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And this is not something I had ever heard about before. I spent many years actually studying this in college, and I was never told about this event. I had to actually go to Hebron to hear this story. But I think it's really important, and it also enlightens us and helps us to understand what is at the base of this conflict. Today, Hebron is completely physically segregated. 80% of the city belongs to the Palestinians, and it is actually the capital of the West Bank, of the occupied territories, whatever you want to call that region. Hebron is their capital. And then the other 20% is on the Israeli side of the border. There are formal border crossings. When you're visiting one side of the city, you can't just walk down the street and get to the other side of the city. There are designated places where you have to cross through. And the citizens of one side of the city cannot cross into the other side of the city. When we had to go through the border crossings, we had to show our passports showing that I'm an American, I'm not an Israeli, or I'm not a Palestinian. And then we were also questioned as to what our religions were, because Jews from other countries are not allowed onto the Palestinian side of the border. The reason we were able to see the city and to cross and visit both sides, we got to visit both sides of the city, but we also got to visit both sides of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And that is because we took something called a dual narrative tour. And in this, the tour started in Jerusalem with a Jewish man who has dual American and Israeli citizenship. And we spent half of our day with him going through the 20% side. That's where we saw Tel Hebron. That's where we saw the Iron Age and the Middle Bronze Age ruins were on that side. And then halfway through our day, we went through the border crossing and we were met on the other side by a Palestinian guide. And he showed us just daily life on the Palestinian side of Hebron. And we got to sit down and have a meal with a Palestinian family. And of course, we got to tour the mosque side of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. The guides referred to this tour in a tongue-in-cheek way as a competing victimology tour. And that's really what it is, because on both sides, we heard horrific stories of how the Jews had brutally attacked the Palestinians and vice versa over the many decades that were narrated in this story. There was no solution to the problem offered as a result of the story or at the end of the day after visiting with both tour guides and meeting people on both sides of the city. It's especially tragic and poignant that here in Hebron, the city is literally divided down the middle. What you have is this place that is a testament to the deep division between Muslims and Jews in the one place that should really be uniting them. The religions agree that in a cave below this 2,000 plus year old building are the remains of Abraham, who is the father of both of those religions, in a city that for thousands of years was a testament to brotherly love and cooperation between the Muslims and the Jews. If you enjoyed this episode of The Red-Haired Archaeologist, then I hope you will listen again soon. New episodes are released each Friday. To learn more about me, check out my website, redhairedarchaeologist.com. There you will find links to my books, this podcast, and my blog, where you can interact with me and other listeners. Also look for my new book, The Red-Haired Archaeologist Digs Israel. It is available now as a print book, ebook, and audiobook from all of your favorite retailers.